They were born at the same moment and stopped breathing in unison. Once, twice, 3 times, and yet they lived. The church called it divine. The doctors called it impossible. What really happened inside that farmhouse has never been told, until now. The snow had started falling before sunrise. By mid-morning, it had already buried the fence posts along the east pasture of the Wendell property, and by noon, the wind began to change. It wasn't the snow that frightened the town of Elkhorn, Nebraska. It was the silence that came with it, the kind that made grown men stop chopping wood and look over their shoulders, the kind that made livestock press themselves against barn walls, lowing in confusion. It was December 21st, 1881, and no one in Elkhorn could explain what happened inside the Wendell home that day. It began with a scream, not one of pain or panic, but a long, high-pitched wail that sounded nothing like a child. The neighbors were the first to hear it, though they lived nearly a quarter mile away. When they reached the Wendell house, they found the front door ajar, snow drifting onto the floorboards. Inside, the fire had gone out. The kettle was hissing dry on the stove, and in the center of the living room stood 3 children, perfectly still, barefoot on the cold wood floor, eyes wide, staring straight ahead. The Wendell children were not ordinary. Born the same night in 1875, under what the midwife called an unnatural quiet, they had grown up with an eerie synchronicity. They spoke in unison until the age of 3. They refused to eat unless seated in a triangle, and whenever a stranger entered the room, they would stop speaking altogether, as though listening to something else entirely. Their parents, Jonah and Cora Wendell, were quiet people, recent migrants from Pennsylvania who had claimed land under the Homestead Act. They did not speak of the children's birth, nor the fact that Cora had once been declared barren by 2 separate physicians. In town, the Wendells kept to themselves. But everyone remembered the day the triplets turned 6, because after that day, things in Elkhorn began to change. Before we go any further, I need to ask you something important. This channel isn't for everyone, only for the bravest souls who dare to uncover the mysteries others fear to speak. If you're one of those true seekers, hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments what state or city you're listening from. Are you brave enough to learn what really happened when belief and biology collided on the Nebraska plains? If so, step back with me into the winter of 1881, where every footprint left behind led only deeper into the unknown. The morning after the scream, Pastor Alden arrived at the Wendell property with 2 deacons. The family was missing. The children were found exactly where the neighbors had described, standing motionless in a triangle, facing each other but not seeing. Their pupils were dilated. When Pastor Alden spoke to them, they did not respond. When he prayed over them, one of the girls began to hum a song in a language no one recognized. The youngest boy, Thomas, began to sway, his mouth moving silently. But it was what he finally said that made the pastor step back in horror. "They're not home right now," Thomas whispered, "but they'll come back when the blood is ready." The pastor did not repeat the words to the congregation. Instead, he summoned Dr. Ezra Holcomb, a Harvard-educated physician who had recently retired to Nebraska after losing his only child to scarlet fever. Holcomb arrived by sled that afternoon and spent over 3 hours examining the children. He found no signs of trauma, no fever, no illness. Their heart rates were slow but steady. Their eyes tracked movement, but they never blinked. When Holcomb tried to separate them, the youngest girl vomited black liquid and collapsed. He left them exactly where they stood and told the pastor to keep them together at all costs. Rumors spread quickly. Some said the Wendells had joined a cult. Others claimed the children had been cursed. The oldest women in Elkhorn spoke in whispers about an old European legend of changelings placed in cribs while the real children were taken beneath the earth. But what frightened people most was that the children seemed aware. When people gathered outside the house, the children would turn, in perfect unison, toward the door. Their eyes would follow voices. When one farmer banged on the wall and shouted that they were possessed, the eldest child blinked for the first time and said quietly, "We were chosen, not taken." Over the next 3 days, the weather worsened. Temperatures dropped below 20 degrees. The town schoolhouse shut down. The church postponed its Christmas service. But still, people visited the Wendell home, just to see them. Some claimed to hear whispering. Others swore they saw the children's breath rise, even though the house was freezing. One man, a ranch hand named Paul Luger, dared to step inside and touch the youngest girl's hand. He later reported that her skin was warm but dry, like paper, and that when he pulled back, his palm was dusted with a fine black powder. That night, Paul Luger hung himself in the barn. He left no note. The townspeople demanded action. Pastor Alden called an emergency council at the church. Some argued the children should be sent to Omaha for testing. Others believed they should be separated and cared for by different families. But the oldest settler in town, Margaret Thistle, a woman who had lived through 5 plagues and a tornado, spoke only once. "If they ain't human," she said, "then neither is what's watching us from the woods." No one responded. But the next morning, someone had boarded up the Wendell home from the outside. It stayed that way for 3 days. On the 4th day, when the boards were removed, the children were gone. And on the floor, written in ash from the fireplace, were 7 words that no one in Elkhorn would ever forget. "We opened the door. They walked in." Sheriff Barrow arrived at the Wendell house shortly before dusk, spurred by the growing unrest in Elkhorn. A devout Lutheran and former Union soldier, Barrow was not a man prone to superstition. He had weathered prairie storms, bandit raids, and outbreaks of typhoid without flinching. But something about the Wendell case shook him. When he stepped through the threshold of the boarded-up house, gun drawn, his breath caught, not because of what he saw, but what he didn't. The house was clean. Impossibly so. No signs of struggle, no overturned furniture, no evidence of the snow that had drifted in just days earlier. The fire had been relit. The floors were swept. A kettle, full this time, steamed gently on the stove. And above the mantel, where the Wendell family portrait had once hung, there was now only a charcoal sketch. 3 faceless figures standing in a triangle. A door outlined in heavy black lines behind them. The word "beneath" was written in all capital letters along the bottom edge, so faint it could have been missed if not for the light slanting through the western window. Barrow searched the house from attic to cellar. Nothing. Not a single footprint in the snow beyond the house. No sled tracks. No signs of the children or their parents. But when he entered the children's bedroom, he found something stranger still. The mirror above their dresser was shattered from the inside. Embedded in the wooden floor were dozens of small shards, all pointing outward, like something had broken through. When he tried to report the findings, the telegraph lines were dead. That same night, in the homes of 3 separate town council members, identical events occurred. Each awoke at precisely 3:17 a.m. Each found the lamps in their bedrooms lit, though they swore they had blown them out before sleep. And in each case, a small, child-sized footprint had been left in ash at the foot of their beds. But the footprint wasn't human. Too long. Toes spread too wide. No heel. Just the ball of the foot and an arc of pressure that ended in a sharp point. The next day, no one in Elkhorn spoke of it. But by week's end, 8 families had moved away without notice. Pastor Alden resigned and left for Omaha. And on the church doors, someone had carved a question that no one wanted answered. What makes you so sure they were children? Dr. Ezra Holcomb, disturbed by the mounting silence, took it upon himself to conduct a private investigation. He returned to the Wendell home with a notebook, a compass, and a bloodhound. The dog refused to enter. Holcomb marked his observations meticulously. Barometric pressure, compass deviations, even the reaction of moths to the home's kerosene light. But what disturbed him most was the mirror in the children's room. Behind the shattered glass, he discovered a crawl space, small, barely large enough for a child to slip through. At its end was a trapdoor sealed with nails that had rusted from the inside. Holcomb pried it open and descended alone. He was gone for nearly an hour. When he emerged, he was pale, soaked in sweat, and silent. He left Elkhorn that same night. His final journal entry, discovered decades later, read, "They mimic us, but they are not us. The ones beneath never left. The Wendells, they were vessels, or bait. I don't know which is worse." By January, the snow had covered the house entirely. Only the chimney remained visible. The town voted to condemn the property, but no one dared to tear it down. Instead, it was listed in the official records as a hazardous structure of unknown stability. A polite way of saying cursed. Children were warned never to approach it. Most obeyed. One didn't. Her name was Lydia Fairbanks. She was 10 years old, a quiet girl with an odd fascination for graveyards and winter birds. On February 3rd, she vanished after school. Her trail led straight to the edge of the Wendell property. Her coat was found snagged on the fence. Her boots were 50 feet further in. Her footprints stopped suddenly, as though she had been lifted straight into the air. 3 days later, her voice was heard. Mrs. Rowley, the school teacher, was closing up the classroom when she heard Lydia's unmistakable laugh coming from the coat closet. When she opened it, there was nothing inside but an old slate. Written in chalk, in Lydia's handwriting. Not lost, just under. The town of Elkhorn changed after that. People stopped calling it a mystery. They called it a blight. Homes within a mile of the Wendell place were abandoned. Property values plummeted. The train stopped running on Sundays and eventually skipped the town entirely. Travelers passing through spoke of strange lights in the snow, of a low, humming sound at night, like singing underwater, of dreams involving a black door that stood on its own in a cornfield. But the most disturbing event came in March. A cartographer named Elias Bram, hired to resurvey the area for new rail routes, reported an anomaly in his maps. The land surrounding the Wendell home had shifted. Trees, once lining the east ridge, now grew along the west. A pond marked on 4 previous surveys no longer existed. When Bram set up a tent near the Wendell property, he documented his own compass reversing polarity during the night. North became south. His watch spun backward, and in the morning his boots, left just outside the tent flap, were filled with ash. He never returned to Omaha. Instead, he wandered into the woods and was found 6 days later, naked, knees bruised, whispering a single word over and over, reflection. He died in his sleep that night, hands clutched to his chest, eyes wide open. And with that, the final consensus was clear. The Wendell mystery could not be explained by science, psychology, or even folklore. What had once been children were now something else entirely, something that lived beneath the ice, something that could imitate innocence, and something that, given the right conditions, might return. By spring of 1883, the Wendell house was no longer visible above the thawing snow. The chimney had collapsed. Vines, unseasonably fast-growing, crept from the soil and covered what little remained of the roof. But what unnerved the townsfolk more than the physical decay was the absence of sound. No wind passed through the trees near the Wendell land. No bird song, not even the rustling of animals. Hunters reported that game avoided the area entirely. One man, Joseph Ames, claimed he saw a deer step near the boundary and freeze mid-motion, as if caught in a still photograph, before quietly backing away and vanishing into the forest. "It knew," he whispered in town later. "It knew not to go where the air listens." In early April, a letter arrived in Elkhorn addressed to the late Pastor Alden. It bore no return address, only a wax seal with an unfamiliar symbol, 3 concentric circles surrounding an inverted tree. Sheriff Barrow, now serving as de facto mayor, opened it. The paper was thick, weathered, handwritten in a looping, old-fashioned script. To whomever holds this burden now, if the Wendell home has awakened, it means the cycle has begun again. Bury the glass. Bury it deep. Destroy every reflection in that house. Do not enter at night, do not speak its name in full, and above all, if they knock, do not answer. There are things older than your land and more patient than your God. The townspeople dismissed it as the work of a lunatic, until a local boy named Reuben, aged 12, brought home a shard of mirror from the site. He had been dared by classmates. That night he screamed until dawn. No one could explain why. His tongue had been sliced down the middle, as though by a blade, but there were no signs of entry. His parents claimed the only thing in his room was the mirror shard, which by morning had turned black as obsidian. Reuben never spoke again. He communicated by drawing. What he drew terrified everyone who saw it. A house with no doors, a staircase spiraling into the earth, and at the bottom, 3 figures with elongated arms, watching a 4th figure sleep inside a glass box. Written beneath the drawing in shaky handwriting was the phrase, "Only one gets to leave." That same week, the town's church bell rang at midnight. No one had pulled the rope. Inside the belfry, the bell was found spinning, without momentum, its clapper swinging in time with an invisible pulse. Beneath it, a pile of dried leaves and salt had been arranged into a circle. In its center was a child's tooth, and on the wall, smeared in something thick and brown, someone had written, "Confession is a doorway." Father Muldoon, who had taken over as pastor, tried to bless the Wendell site with holy water. He collapsed 10 feet from the boundary, convulsing, eyes rolled back, muttering words in a tongue no one recognized. He later described seeing a field of children with no faces, holding ropes that led nowhere. That night, every mirror in the church shattered simultaneously. With panic mounting, Barrow turned to the one man in town no one trusted, but everyone feared: Ephraim Lorne. Ephraim had been born during a blizzard in 1811 and was rumored to be half native, half something else. He lived alone in a cabin on the southern ridge and was known for muttering to animals and collecting bones. Some said he was a warlock. Others believed he had simply gone mad in the woods. But when Barrow arrived at his door, Ephraim answered before the knock, already holding his coat. "They've come up for air," he said simply, "and they've brought memory with them." Ephraim agreed to help, but warned the sheriff there would be a cost. "Not all who help can leave unchanged," he said, "and not all questions want answers." The next morning, Ephraim performed what he called a listening rite at the boundary of the Wendell property. He poured salt in a perfect circle, lit 7 candles made from wax mixed with ash, and chanted in a dialect that sounded like reversed English. When the candles went out, he said only one thing: "They want the girl back." No one knew what he meant. But that night, Lydia Fairbanks, who had vanished months prior, was seen standing at the foot of her parents' bed. She was silent, pale. Her eyes were clouded over, like cataracts. She pointed toward the window and whispered, "He's still sleeping, but not for long." Then she collapsed. Doctors called it a seizure. Her pulse was erratic, her skin freezing to the touch. She remained unconscious for 3 days, during which time every animal within a half-mile of the house went missing. When Lydia awoke, she asked her mother one question. "Do we have a mirror in the basement?" The mother, confused, said no. Lydia stared ahead, blank-eyed, and said, "We do now." Sheriff Barrow, now desperate, returned to the Wendell house with Ephraim and 2 deputies. What they found was not a ruin, but a restoration. The house, which had been all but destroyed, now stood whole. Its wood gleamed with fresh varnish. The windows were intact. Smoke curled from the chimney. Inside, the furniture was returned. Toys lay on the floor. A clock ticked, but no one was home. Then they heard it. 3 knocks from beneath the floorboards. Ephraim went pale. "We're too late," he muttered. Barrow ordered the floor pried open. Underneath, they found a tunnel. Carved into the walls were the same 3 circles from the letter's seal. And in the dirt, handprints. Dozens of them, all small, all pointing up. At the tunnel's end was a glass coffin. Inside it, a child, perfectly preserved. It wasn't Lydia, and it wasn't any of the Wendell children. It was someone older, wearing clothes from another century. Her hands were clasped around a mirror, the same one Reuben had taken the shard from. Ephraim dropped to his knees. "She's the anchor," he whispered. "She's what lets them through." When asked who she was, he simply replied, "She was the first." As they turned to leave, the house began to shake. A hum filled the air like a chorus of whispers underwater. The candles they had brought sputtered out. And on the wall behind them, scratched in fresh wood, were 6 words: "Don't wake him, don't wake him." They left the Wendell house before sundown. Ephraim had insisted. "It breathes with the dark," he said. "It remembers better when the sun is gone." But even in daylight, something followed them. Sheriff Barrow noticed it first. The shadows from the trees stretched in the wrong direction, as though the sun's light bent around the Wendell property. Deputy Marlin swore he saw a second set of footprints behind their own in the snow. And Ephraim stopped speaking altogether. Back at town, they barricaded the church with salt lines and iron nails. Lydia Fairbanks had begun whispering names in her sleep, names of the original settlers long dead, and dates that hadn't come yet. Her mother claimed she scrawled symbols into the walls with her fingernails, 3 concentric circles over and over, until her fingers bled. And always beneath those circles a single word: below. Father Muldoon attempted an exorcism. He stood over Lydia's bed, holy water trembling in his hand. As he began the rites, Lydia opened her eyes, milky, ancient, unblinking, and recited the Latin prayer in perfect reverse. The air in the room dropped 10 degrees. The candles extinguished themselves. When she spoke again, it wasn't in her voice. "She's not yours to cleanse, priest," the thing said. "She chose to look." That was when Muldoon saw the mirror. It hadn't been there before. A small round glass, no bigger than a dinner plate, resting against the wall. But it showed no reflection, only depth. Black, infinite depth. And within it, a flicker, like something moving closer. Muldoon smashed it with the base of his crucifix. The glass cracked but didn't shatter. Lydia screamed, not from her mouth but from the windows. Every pane of glass in the room exploded outward. Sheriff Barrow ordered Lydia placed under supervision in the rectory basement. "If she's possessed, we keep her grounded," he told Ephraim. But Ephraim only shook his head. "She's not possessed," he said. "She's remembering." "What the hell does that mean?" "It means she's seen what's buried beneath us, and it sees her now too." Barrow didn't sleep that night, nor did anyone else in Elkhorn. Every clock in town stopped at 2:14 a.m. The moon turned a shade of red no one had words for, and from the direction of the Wendell house there came a sound, not a scream, not a howl, but something deeper, a tremor in the bones, a groan of ancient wood or flesh or both. The next day, a girl named Hannah Burke disappeared. She had been walking home from the apothecary with her father. One moment she was beside him, the next gone. All that remained was a ribbon, and beside it a mirror shard. Barrow had had enough. "We dig," he said. Ephraim tried to stop him. "There are rules, there are seals, there are truths so old they forgot how to lie. If we uncover them, they remember themselves." But Barrow didn't care. He returned to the tunnel under the Wendell house with a team of 5. Ephraim, 2 deputies, and a volunteer from town, Dale Worthing, a schoolteacher whose son had begun muttering the names of unborn children in his sleep. They descended into the earth with lanterns, shovels, and Bibles. The tunnel was longer than before. Where once it ended with the coffin, it now branched. 7 corridors, perfectly carved, like roots extending into the darkness. Each bore markings, symbols from no known language but somehow familiar, like things seen in dreams or remembered from another life. They chose the central path. What they found was not a room, but a chamber. Circular, vast, walls lined with mirrors. Hundreds of them. None reflecting anything. Instead, the glass shimmered with scenes. Scenes from Elkhorn, children playing, a woman baking, men building the church. But each scene twisted. The children turned to stare. The woman cut her own hands open. The men built not a church, but a well, with a body inside. Ephraim collapsed to his knees. "They've been watching," he murmured, "feeding on our image, our memory. They're not ghosts. They're reflections that never stopped growing." In the center of the chamber stood a pedestal. Upon it, a book, bound in stitched leather, sealed with wax and hair. Barrow reached for it. The moment his fingers touched the cover, the mirrors groaned, not broke, groaned, as though they were lungs filling with breath. And from the glass, shapes began to press outward. Children with missing mouths, women with no eyes, men with stretched, hanging skin and mirrors embedded in their chests. Ephraim shouted, "We leave now!" But it was too late. Deputy Holloway screamed as something pulled him backward. His lantern fell, rolled, and extinguished. In the brief flicker, the others saw Holloway's face, stretched, distorted, as though reflected in warped glass. Then he was gone. The corridor behind them closed. Stone sealed the entrance. Barrow, Ephraim, and Dale had no choice but to run. The mirrors screamed. Not a metaphor, actual sound, high-pitched and wet, like metal grinding on bone. They reached the forked tunnels and took the leftmost, guided by instinct or something older. The tunnel spat them out not in the Wendell basement, but in the field behind the church. They were covered in dirt. Barrow held the book. It pulsed. Not glowed, pulsed like a heartbeat. The church bell rang, again. No one pulled the rope. That night, a letter appeared nailed to the church door. In the same looping hand as before, "You were warned. The girl is marked. The mirrors remember, close the book or lose the town. The next knock comes from inside. Barrow burned the book. It didn't char, it screamed. Ephraim begged him to bury it instead, deep with salt, in an iron box, and never speak its name again. But Barrow was stubborn. He locked the book in the church's crypt. 3 days later, the town's children began sleepwalking. All of them. Every child under 10 was found in the cemetery at midnight, surrounding the same grave, unmarked, freshly dug. And beneath the soil, when exhumed, was another mirror. Clean, new, waiting. The mirror they found buried beneath the grave should have been impossible. It was flawless, unmarred by dirt or time, and cold to the touch, so cold that frost bloomed around it even in the July heat. Sheriff Barrow didn't want to bring it inside the church, but the town council insisted. They said it needed to be studied, understood, possibly destroyed. But you can't destroy what never lived. They laid it in the chapel basement, on a bed of coarse salt and cedar, and sealed the doors. Father Muldoon read from the Psalms. Ephraim scribbled symbols in chalk. Deputy Marlin stood guard with a rifle. That night, the mirror moved. No one saw it happen, but by dawn, the mirror no longer lay flat. It was standing, propped upright against the far wall, untouched, yet facing the door directly. Father Muldoon insisted no one entered. "It's testing us," he said. "Mirrors are doors, but this one is a voice." "What's it saying?" Barrow asked. Muldoon shook his head. "Not to us." That day, the children began humming. Not a tune anyone recognized, not a song from church or school, just 7 notes repeated endlessly in the same rhythm. When asked what it meant, the children simply stopped, stared blankly, and said, "It's not for you." Ephraim grew pale. "It's the convergence," he muttered. "I've seen this in old records. Every 70 years, in places where the veil grows thin, something calls through the glass. It chooses the young because they remember being old." Barrow had no patience for riddles. He ordered the mirror boarded over, the basement locked, and the children kept indoors after sunset. But it was already too late. At 3:12 a.m., the mirror sang. Not with music, but with vibrations, low, guttural, thrumming like a cello played underwater. It shook the walls of the chapel, it cracked the bell tower, and beneath the sound a voice whispered a single phrase, "Let her return." By morning, Lydia Fairbanks was gone. The window in her room was closed, the door still bolted, but in her bed lay her dress, perfectly folded, and one lock of hair. Barrow, shaking with rage, confronted Ephraim. "You knew this would happen. You knew and said nothing." "I told you the truth," Ephraim answered. "You just didn't believe it." Barrow ordered every able man in Elkhorn to search the woods. They combed the riverbanks, the fields, the Wendell property. Nothing. Until someone checked the grave again. The soil had been turned. Fresh prints circled the grave. Bare feet. Small. Too small for any adult. And where the mirror had once been buried was now an empty pit. But that wasn't the worst of it. In the church basement, behind the boarded door, the mirror was gone. Only salt remained, and a message scratched into the wall above it in tiny letters that shimmered like mercury. She looked too long. Panic spread. Parents locked their doors. The school closed. Services were canceled. And still, the humming continued. This time, not from the children, but from the walls themselves. Barrow posted armed guards at every exit of town. That night, Elkhorn dreamed as one. A shared nightmare. Each citizen saw the same thing. Lydia, standing in a field of mirrors, her eyes black and bottomless, her mouth sewn shut with red thread. Around her, figures moved, tall, twisted, made of glass and smoke. One by one, they placed hands on her shoulders, and as they did, she began to crack, like porcelain under pressure. When Barrow awoke, he found the church bell swinging, though there was no wind. Inside the chapel, 7 mirrors now stood, identical, each reflecting nothing but static. Ephraim stared at them for hours. "They're memories," he whispered, "but not ours. They're reflections from the other side. They've bled through." "What do they want?" Barrow demanded. Ephraim didn't answer right away. Then, "They want to finish what began in 1813. What happened in 1813? Ephraim looked ill. The founding. Barrow scowled. This town was founded in 1832. Not officially. The first settlement was a failed colony. They built their homes over a sinkhole. Didn't know it was sacred ground to the tribes here, a place of vision, where shamans claimed the world grew thin. Barrow leaned in. What happened to them? They vanished, left behind one thing, a well filled with mirrors, sealed with salt, never spoken of again. The sheriff's face hardened. "Where's that well now?" Ephraim didn't blink. Under the schoolhouse. By noon, the building was evacuated. Barrow, Ephraim, and a handful of men tore up the floorboards with crowbars and prayer. Beneath the foundation, they found stone. Not natural, carved, old and wet and breathing. A well, covered by a circular iron plate, engraved with the same symbols Lydia had drawn into the walls weeks before. Barrow hesitated. "Whatever's down there," he said, "it's calling her back." "She never left," Ephraim replied. They lifted the plate. The stench was immediate. Not rot, something older, like burned paper, wet copper, and milk gone sour in sunlight. The air shimmered, and in the bottom of the well, they saw not water, but light. It moved, shifted, spoke without sound. Barrow dropped to his knees. He saw his mother's face, his brother's death, the day he first killed a man. Then something deeper, something that hadn't happened yet. A door opening. "Close it," Ephraim begged. Barrow shook himself free, forced the plate back on, and nailed it shut. But he didn't sleep that night, because when he returned home, he found a mirror on his porch. Not his. In its reflection, his house stood in ruins, and behind it, Lydia, watching. By morning, 7 more mirrors appeared. This time, not in the church, nor in the woods, but in people's homes. On mantels, in pantries, in cellars and barns. Each one identical, each one silent. The townsfolk swore they hadn't placed them there. Some tried to cover them. Some tried to break them. But the glass wouldn't shatter, and anything draped over them burned to ash by sunrise. In every mirror, the reflection was slightly wrong. No one could agree on the details. Some said the sky was darker, others noticed a second moon. A few swore they saw their own face age before their eyes, but all of them reported the same thing: Lydia, watching from just behind them, blinking slower than she should. The humming returned, stronger this time. Not just from walls, but from within. Men woke up humming in their sleep. Mothers found babies cooing the 7-note melody before they could speak. Dogs refused to enter rooms with mirrors. Horses refused to drink. Sheriff Barrow gathered the town in the square and addressed them beneath the summer sun. "We are under siege," he declared, "not by an enemy with guns or torches, but with reflections and memory, with symbols and silence, But this is our town, and we will not be run out by fear." The crowd did not cheer. Most looked at their feet. Because that morning, 3 more children had gone missing, and in their place, 3 perfect mirrors. Ephraim climbed the steps to the platform beside Barrow. He held a book, bound in animal skin, stained with what looked like oil. "This is older than Elkhorn," he said. "Older than Kansas. It's a ledger of the veil, a catalog of places where the membrane between this world and the other grows thin. There's a pattern, a cycle." He pointed to a diagram, a triangle drawn across a crude map of the United States. "At the center of the triangle," he said, "is Elkhorn." Barrow peered closer. "What's the triangle made of?" "2 sites of mass death," Ephraim said grimly. "One natural, one not. The triangle's base runs from the site of the New Madrid earthquake to the Wounded Knee massacre. The top point?" Barrow stared at the book. "Us. That's why this keeps happening," Ephraim continued. "It's not about Lydia. It's not about the mirror. It's about Elkhorn. We are the hinge, the crack in the doorway." Barrow clenched his fists. "Then we need to close it." But Ephraim was already shaking his head. "It's not that simple. Every time a door is closed, another opens. The only way to silence a mirror is to answer it." "Answer it how?" Ephraim paused. "Someone has to go through." Barrow refused. So did everyone else, until Mrs. Agnes Clay stood up from the crowd. She was 74 years old, childless, widowed 3 times. She walked with a cane and baked for the whole town every Sunday, and when she spoke, the square fell silent. "If this place is cursed," she said, "then it's because we left something behind. Maybe it was never ours to begin with. Maybe we're the ones who broke the silence, but I remember Lydia. I held her in church. I taught her how to thread a needle. If she's still in there, I'll find her." Barrow tried to stop her. So did Ephraim. But by dusk, the town gathered again, this time inside the church. The mirror was waiting, not boarded, not humming, just still. Agnes approached it with a candle and a prayer. She stood before it, closed her eyes and whispered, "I forgive you." Then she stepped forward and disappeared. The mirror rippled like water, and then it shattered. Without sound, without debris. Just gone. The room fell still. Then someone gasped. In the space where the mirror had been, a staircase now descended. Stone, wet and lit from below. Barrow moved to block it, but Ephraim grabbed his shoulder. "She made a path," he said. "We can't waste it." So they went down. The steps twisted like a corkscrew. They led not down but inward. The air was thick. Every breath tasted like pennies and ash. And at the bottom, they found a chamber of mirrors, dozens of them, maybe hundreds arranged like a hive. But each one held a person. Some were asleep. Some were weeping. Some stared blankly, mouthing words no one could hear. Barrow recognized them. Lydia, the other missing children, the founders' wives, the triplets from the town that burned in '49, even people he'd only seen in old daguerreotypes. They were all there, trapped, alive. "We have to break them out," Barrow whispered. "No," Ephraim said. "We have to break the cycle." He opened the ledger again and read aloud, a passage in a language that bent the air. The mirrors began to vibrate. One by one, they cracked, but not outward. They cracked inward, swallowed themselves, turned to smoke, and the people inside began to wake, screaming. Agnes reached through one, Lydia through another. Then something else reached back, long fingers, glistening, made of fractured glass. They scraped at the edges of the mirrors, trying to pull themselves through. Barrow fired at them. Bullets disappeared in ripples. Ephraim drew a line of salt. The light flickered. Then came the scream. Not human. Not even alive. It echoed through the chamber, louder than thunder, deeper than stone. It broke the candles. It shattered time. And then, silence. Agnes collapsed. Lydia collapsed. The mirrors crumbled to dust, and the stairs behind them reappeared. They carried the children out, 10 in all, alive, changed. Not one of them could remember what they saw, except Lydia. She turned to Barrow at the top of the stairs and said, "It's not over." By the time the frost came, the town of Elkhorn had surrendered to ritual. They no longer spoke of days of the week, only of mirror days and silence nights. Every third morning, the townspeople gathered in the chapel, not to pray, but to listen. They brought no instruments, made no music. They sat in pews while the children stood before them, eyes closed, mouths open, and they waited. Sometimes nothing came. Other times, the children spoke in unison, a single voice from many mouths. The voice always changed, sometimes low and gravelly, sometimes airy and sharp, but always wrong, like it came from the center of the earth or the coldest edge of heaven. It would whisper names, dates, numbers. At first, they tried to decipher meaning. Was it prophecy? Was it memory? But on the seventh gathering, the voice recited, without pause, the birth and death dates of every resident in the town, even the newborns, even the unborn. That night, 2 families fled into the fog. They were never seen again. The chapel became the only safe place. Ephraim drew ancient symbols into the walls, symbols no one could translate, not even he. But they worked. The fog did not enter. The mirrors did not form. But the children, they changed. Their skin grew pale, translucent in certain light. Their irises dimmed until their eyes looked coated in ash. They stopped responding to their names. They no longer felt hunger or pain. One girl, Clara Mott, was found barefoot in the snow, smiling. Her feet were blackened from frostbite, but she didn't flinch. She only said, "He's almost here," and stared at the schoolhouse where the window panes had begun to hum. That same week, Agnes collapsed in the chapel, clutching her chest. They thought she was dying, but she awoke screaming, not in pain, but in warning. "Don't speak his name. Don't speak the mirror man's name. That's how he hears you." From that moment, none dared speak the figure's title. Not aloud, not even in whispers. But they all knew who she meant. The being in the glass. The mouth with no face. The presence that had watched them through generations, waiting for the door to crack. And now it was ajar. Lydia became the key. She walked differently now, slow, intentional, as if pacing in time with something else. She would pause in doorways and look at nothing. Hours passed with her fingers tracing the air as though following invisible threads. One night, she stood before the chapel mirror, the original one they'd hidden away, and said simply, "It wants a name." Ephraim begged her not to continue. But she ignored him. She stepped forward, placed her hand on the mirror, and whispered, "I name thee." Before she could finish, the mirror fractured, not in shards, but in veins. The entire surface webbed outward like ice beneath pressure. From the cracks bled smoke. It didn't fall, it rose, curling upward, spiraling like incense. Inside the smoke, shapes turned, faces half-formed, eyes without lids. mouths filled with too many teeth. Screams echoed backward, like a phonograph spun in reverse. Lydia collapsed. When she awoke, her voice was gone, permanently. Ephraim called this mercy. The church elders gathered once more. A decision had to be made. They could no longer contain it, and they feared what might happen when the thaw came. "We burn the mirror," said one. "We bury it deeper," said another. "No," Agnes rasped. "We send it back." "How?" "We finish what began, we open it fully, and we push." The chapel floor was cleared, every artifact of God removed. No crosses, no holy text, only salt, ash, and 7 candles. The children were brought in one by one. They did not resist. They sat in the circle, surrounding the cracked mirror, and they waited. Agnes began the chant. Not English, not Latin. Something older, something forgotten. The children joined, mouths moving in perfect synchronicity. The mirror pulsed, light flashing from within, not reflected, but radiated, like a second sun buried in shadow. The temperature dropped. Breath became visible. Then the glass melted, not in heat, but in shape. It rippled like water. The frame liquefied and hovered. The children stood. One by one, they stepped into the mirror and vanished. No ripple, no splash. Just gone. Only Lydia remained. She turned to Agnes, smiled, and said without sound, "Close the door." Agnes wept and obeyed. The chant reversed. The mirror dimmed. The frame turned to soot and fell apart. The light faded, and the chapel returned to silence. Of the children, only Lydia ever returned. But she came back different. Not wrong, not eerie, just distant. Like her soul was tied to another room. Ephraim left Elkhorn soon after. Agnes died one winter later. Her final words spoken in a language no one understood. The chapel was sealed. The church records locked. And for the next 40 years, no one spoke of what had happened in 1883. Not until the frost returned, and the mirrors began humming again. When the frost returned in the winter of 1923, the few descendants of Elkhorn's original families felt it first. Not in their bones, but in their dreams. They all saw the same thing, a mirror, cracked, and hanging in a room with no walls. A child, barefoot, whispering in reverse. A voice, deep and hollow, asking the same question over and over. "Do you remember your name?" Elders, who had once been children during the 1883 incident, began to speak again, some for the first time in decades. Their voices were brittle, like splinters of old wood. They repeated dates, just as they had as children. But these were new dates, names unfamiliar, places that did not exist on any current map. Then, without warning, a man named Clark Dinsmore, descendant of the Mott family, walked out onto the frozen lake with a hand mirror clutched to his chest. He faced the wind, spoke a single word no one could decipher, and then stepped forward into the ice. Not onto it, into it. He vanished beneath the frozen surface, but no crack was left behind. The mirror, however, floated for a moment, spinning slowly before it too sank straight down as though pulled by invisible hands. That night, Lydia awoke screaming. She hadn't spoken aloud in 40 years. The words she said chilled everyone who heard them. "He is here, he never left, and the door was never closed." In desperation, a historian from St. Louis named Edward Coyle arrived in Elkhorn. He had studied the town's strange records for years. Whispers of triplets who defied biology, families who erased themselves, sermons that turned into seances. He begged Lydia to speak to him. She refused. He brought her old photos, journals, church records. She only stared at them. Until he laid down a drawing, one pulled from the margins of a forgotten theology book, a sketch of the veiled host, a being from Gnostic lore described as the mirror between men and their maker. At the sight of it, Lydia wept. She reached for a pencil with trembling hands and scrawled 3 words across the table. Not veiled, waiting. Edward stayed in town, collecting testimony from anyone who still remembered. He discovered more than he expected. A schoolteacher had kept one of the children's sketches from 1883, a charcoal drawing of a figure with 7 mouths and no eyes, labeled only "He Who Knows You." A midwife confessed that during the births of the triplets, all the town's clocks stopped for exactly 13 minutes. And an old carpenter revealed he had once helped hide a mirror in the abandoned root cellar of the chapel, beneath 7 layers of brick and iron. Edward organized an excavation. They found the mirror, uncracked, clean, pristine, as if waiting. The town voted to destroy it. They built a pyre of saltwood and sulfur. But as the fire began, the wind changed direction, sudden and violent. The flames reversed course and froze in midair, curling back toward the torchbearer. The fire did not burn. It consumed the torchbearer with silence. His body collapsed into powder, as if he had never lived. The mirror remained untouched. Lydia was brought to the chapel again. She stood before the mirror. For the first time in 40 years, she spoke clearly. "This is not a window, it is a wound." She turned to Edward. "He didn't come through the mirror. We were reflected into him." The townspeople didn't understand, but they listened. That night, the chapel bell rang at midnight, though no one had touched it. Every reflective surface in town, glass, water, metal, turned black. Children began to murmur in their sleep. Adults saw their reflections delay by half a second. And in every mirror, behind their own image, a second figure emerged. Taller, thinner, always grinning. They covered the mirrors. They doused the lake. They even blinded themselves one by one to escape the gaze. But it was no longer about the mirror. It was about memory. The past was bleeding forward. What had been locked was now unfolding. One woman, Hannah Porter, reported hearing her mother's voice in her baby's cry. Another man, Thomas Elridge, swore his dead brother's shadow followed him at noon. Edward took to recording every incident, mapping each appearance, each distortion, each whispered word. He discovered a pattern. Every 13 days, the incidents peaked. Every 39 days, one resident vanished. Every 91 days, a child was found speaking backward in a tongue no one could translate. He called it the unfolding. But Lydia corrected him. It's not unfolding, it's remembering. Elkhorn wasn't haunted. It was infected with itself. What had happened in 1883 was not an event. It was a memory taking root in the soil, a loop with its own hunger. The mirror had not trapped something. It had taught the town how to reflect its own nightmares until they became real. Edward proposed evacuation. No one agreed. They couldn't leave. Because when they tried, they saw themselves standing at the town's edge, identical, expressionless, and silent. Mirrored versions of themselves, waiting. Some tried to run anyway. Those that did vanished. Their reflections stayed behind and began attending church, reading their mail, smiling at their children. The town became a portrait in duplicate. 2 Elkhorns. One seen, one reflected, and the mirror was the witness. Edward knew what must be done. But Lydia warned him, to end it, you must enter it, and no one comes back the same. He asked her, "What's on the other side?" She replied, "There is no side, only depth." He prepared a team, 7 volunteers, 7 torches, 7 nails. They entered the cellar, they held hands, and they stepped into the mirror. Only Edward returned, and he had no shadow. When asked what he saw, he simply whispered, "We are the lie. He is the memory." Then he collapsed. The mirror finally cracked. Not from impact, from exhaustion. It had remembered enough, but the town didn't recover. Not fully. The reflections were gone, but the town now cast no shadows, and the people of Elkhorn could no longer dream. They just waited. For the frost, for the bell, for the mirror to mend itself again, because some wounds do not close. They remember. There are no tourists in Elkhorn anymore, no travelers passing through, no salesmen knocking on doors, not even the occasional lost hiker or drifter seeking shelter. The signs into town were taken down after the frost of 25. Not by the county, not by the state, by the town itself. No one wanted to explain what Elkhorn was anymore. It was easier to forget, to let it shrink off the map, a ghost in the folds of Mississippi, a town that once thrived, now barely murmurs. But if you go there, if you truly find your way in, you'll see that it's not empty. The people remain, but something about them is wrong. Not grotesque, not monstrous, just wrong in a way that's hard to explain. They look like they remember something you don't. They smile at things that aren't there. And they never, ever look in mirrors. There are no mirrors in Elkhorn. Not in bathrooms, not in storefronts, not even in the old barber shop. Now boarded up and overgrown. The glass has been painted over. The reflective metal polished until matte. Even puddles are filled with stones. It's not superstition, it's defense. One resident, Miriam Hale, once a bright girl with a fondness for reading aloud in the town square, now spends her days pacing the edge of the lake. She's older, slower, lips always moving, but never speaking. If you ask what she's doing, she won't answer. But if you wait long enough, if you sit quietly by the frozen reeds, you'll hear her whisper something you can't unhear. Reflections are promises we failed to keep. The town's only surviving pastor, Reverend Cole, never speaks of God anymore. He speaks of the image, not as a deity, not as a demon, but as a memory made conscious. He claims it was born the moment the Triplets died, when the town tried to forget what it had witnessed, what it had allowed, what it had become. Elkhorn, he says, became its own punishment. Not cursed, reflected. And when you reflect evil long enough, it begins to think for itself. He keeps a journal, locked behind rusted hinges and prayer beads. Inside are records of every mirrored incident, every name, every disappearance, every replacement. There's one passage that repeats in each entry. Where the light ends, the memory begins. What that means, no one knows, or they pretend not to. In 1932, a letter was found nailed to the inside of the old chapel door. No one saw who left it. It was unsigned, written in perfect cursive, though it slanted upward toward the end like someone was writing without looking. It read, "You cannot bury what remembers you. You cannot run from the thing that shares your face. You cannot silence a memory, only feed it." And we fed it too well. The Triplets were not an anomaly. They were a mirror made flesh. We didn't birth them. We remembered them into being. And memory hungers. Do not open the cellar. Do not pray to your reflection. And above all, do not name what you see. Of course, someone named it. Years later, a boy named Eli found a torn page tucked behind a loose brick in the schoolhouse. It had one word written in red ink: Marilyn. He said it out loud. His eyes went white. He didn't scream. He smiled. He's still smiling. He hasn't aged a day. No one says the word now, not even in thought, not even in dreams. But if you press your ear to the old library walls at midnight, you'll hear children repeating it backward, over and over, like a lullaby. It doesn't translate, but it echoes. And every time it's spoken, the shadows in town get a little longer, a little slower, a little less obedient. There are theories, of course. Some say the triplets weren't born, but summoned. Others claim the mirror was never made by human hands, that it wasn't a mirror at all, but a mouth opened in the wrong direction. Some believe the town never existed, that Elkhorn was the memory of a place that collapsed under its own reflection. And others say Elkhorn is everywhere, that every town, every home, every face that avoids its reflection, every whisper in an empty hallway, is just another ripple from the same broken surface, a consequence of looking too long, too deep, of daring to remember. Edward Coyle's name faded from public record, but his journal survived. Buried in a library basement in Vicksburg, mislabeled as poetry. Inside, on the final page, was his last recorded thought. We cracked the mirror, but not the memory. It lives, in bone, in breath, in names unspoken and questions never asked. If you see your reflection blink when you do not run. It already knows where you're going. If you see yourself smiling when you feel nothing at all, do not cry. It feeds on recognition. And above all, if you feel something watching you through the mirror, don't turn away. That's how it steps through. Elkhorn remains, not on the map, but in memory. And memory, as we've seen, cannot be buried. It watches. It waits. And one day, when enough eyes forget what they saw, the mirror will mend itself and open once more. Because some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. Some are meant to be remembered forever.